Good morning. This is Susie Hudson. I'm the Clinical Director here at NADA, and welcome to another session of the Early Intervention and Innovation Funds presentations. This is number 5 in the series, and we're really glad that you could join us today. The Early Intervention and Innovation Funds are provided by the Ministry of Health, and they are going out to non-government drug and alcohol treatment and members of NADA to really look at evaluating, to exploring some of the innovative practices that are going on, and that's the purpose of these presentations today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, and wherever you are joining us from today, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and to future generations. We have a lot to thank our Aboriginal colleagues and clients for in terms of innovation and better improving practice. So today we've got 2 presentations, and what we'll do is we will actually provide the presentation to you, then do some Q&A after the presentation, and then back to the second presentation and some more Q&A. And so now I'd like to welcome to the webinar Dr. Alison Beck. She will be presenting today, and she will be examining routine outcome monitoring plus feedback in Smart Recovery Australia, a feasibility examining smart routine outcome measurement. So I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Alison Beck. She's from the University of Wollongong, and her bio is on our website. Over to you, Alison.
So thank you very much for everyone's patience there while I fumbled around. So following on from what Susie was saying before, I just wanted to make sure that I too acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which everyone is joining today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise the continuing connection and contribution to the land. And I'd also like to be able to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people who are here today. So, just to begin with, what I'd like to do is start with a couple of acknowledgements. First of all, to our partner, Smart Recovery Australia, and Ryan McLaughlin's on the call today and will be popping into the Q&A session in case you have any Smart Recovery specific questions. I would also like to acknowledge our funding from New South Wales Health and also our development partner, GHO. Massive shout outs to them, particularly to Ryan and Marcos. They definitely went above and beyond. Their patience, their creativity, their skill definitely allowed us to come up with a product that went well beyond what we were hoping to achieve. And they were so passionate about being able to create something that could potentially be of benefit to people in the future. So we'd also like to acknowledge our contributors. We've had a lot of input from Smart Recovery participants and facilitators, our steering committee, the head of digital and brand at Smart Recovery, and also really important to mention that I am just one of many in an incredibly talented research team. So in terms of a little bit of a background, I'm aware that many of you are probably already aware of the importance of mutual support, but I thought that I'd provide a little bit of an orientation to give some context to the presentation. So mutual support is something that's incredibly important when it comes from recovery from addictive behaviours. So that's sort of informational, social, educational support that people give and receive to one another. It's really important, and it's something that's recommended by Australian and international clinical guidelines. And although there's a range of different models available, our evidence primarily comes from a 12-step approach. So you might be familiar with, for example, Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. But as with anything, there's definitely no one size fits all when it comes to accessing treatment and support. And so if we're to be sensitive to the needs and preferences of the individual, to be consistent with that recovery-oriented model of care, we need alternative options available, and that's where Smart Recovery comes in. So if there's a bit of a mismatch between people's own approach and that of this 12-step model, then we've got other options that are available for them to be able to access that important mutual support. And that's where Smart Recovery comes in. So Smart Recovery is a mutual support group grounded in motivational interviewing, cognitive behaviour therapy, It's run by a trained facilitator and runs in 90-minute groups. So our team were the first to do a systematic review into smart recovery. So this is a little bit of extra context for the current project. So basically we took a really thorough, comprehensive approach, pulling together all of the published and unpublished literature to get a bit of a sense about what it said for the evidence base for smart recovery. And of particular importance to the current presentation and the current project is that we were also really interested in understanding what literature was out there, where were the gaps and how we could improve. And so although we did find promising evidence for smart recovery, what was also really beneficial about that process is that we found that there was definitely room to be able to improve the evidence base. So the research was mostly about alcohol. Outcomes were typically measured in terms of substance-related behaviours, say, for example, drinks per drinking day or number of drinks per week. And although that's definitely an important thing to be able to keep an eye on, other types of important outcomes, things like quality of life, functioning, mental health, that's a big one, all of those were really few and far between. And so we came away from that process with a sense that there was a real need to be able to adopt a much more comprehensive or holistic approach to measuring outcomes, to expand the evidence base between beyond alcohol rather, and also to make sure that we're using standardised outcome measures so that it's a bit easier to compare study to study. And that's where the current project comes in. So what we wanted to do was to be able to develop a tool that collected standardised outcome data to be able to give us a bit of a sense of the types of outcomes that people were seeing as a result of smart recovery. But we also wanted it to be helpful. We didn't want it to be something that was just going to be a ticker box data collection exercise. We wanted it to be something that this tool would also help to support the self-management of the individual. And so we wanted to, if we're capturing all of this data, we also wanted to make sure that we were going to feed it back to people in some kind of meaningful way. And so in terms of this project, we conducted it across 2 stages. Stage 1 was all about the development of the tool so that we'd be able to collect that data and provide the feedback. And then step 2 was a feasibility study. Every time I hit my mouse, it moves forward, apologies. Step 2 was a feasibility study where we looked at whether or not people would use it and whether it was helpful. Okay, so for this slide, very busy, and apologies for that, but reason for popping it in is that I just wanted to give people a sense of the sort of process that we went through in developing this app. We really wanted to make sure that it was something that was a real thorough, comprehensive approach. In particular, we wanted to make sure that it was grounded, that the tool that we ended up developing was going to be grounded in evidence and also published guidelines and frameworks. And that's where the person-based, the ideas framework and the BIT model come from. They're all published guidelines that are relevant to the development of digital technologies. Also central to our process, and something that was incredibly important to us and also the team at GHO, was that we were going to develop something that was sensitive to the needs and preferences of the end user. And so that's why stage 1 was very much about a qualitative approach or using qualitative methods to be able to inform app development. So during the stage 1 of development, we conducted qualitative interviews with smart recovery participants and facilitators to inform the content and design of the tool that we were developing. And so when I keep saying tool, I should say that we ended up choosing to do a smartphone app. Reason for choosing an app is that the functional capabilities mean that it's a real quick, easy way of being able to provide that tailored feedback that we wanted to do. And also because smartphones are just so common that it's something that is quite available to people. So we used qualitative interviews to be able to get a sense of the sorts of things that people wanted to have in the app, the proposed measures, the stuff that would help or get in the way of engaging with the app, how they felt about using it as to collect this kind of data and also as part of smart recovery groups. And I think one thing that I really appreciate and am really grateful for is that during this second stage here, we had the opportunity to be able to work quite closely with end users. GHO would develop a little bit prototype of the app Participants would come into the office, play around with it, give us feedback on what was working well, less well, and then it would get amended. So we've been able to develop something that is truly user-informed from the outset. So here we go. Welcome to SmartTrack. This is the product that we ended up being able to develop. It's freely available on Android and Apple, and I'll, at the end of the presentation, talk you through some of the updates that we've made and where we're at in terms of the actual final version. Because our remit was to be able to develop something that allowed us to capture that routine outcome monitoring data, I thought it would be really useful just to take a moment to reflect on the data that SmartTrack can actually capture. Also worthwhile mentioning that looks a bit busy and big, but when we administered the questions to people, we rotated on a week-to-week basis so that people weren't hit with a million questions and then disengage. So each week when people answer questions, it doesn't take any more than about 5 to 10 minutes. So we wanted to develop something that was holistic. I think we have. We look at addictive behaviours, recovery, urges, quality of life, mental health, goals, values, self-efficacy. Our tools come from, where possible, routine outcome monitoring tools that are already available. So for example, with the comms system, some of the comms questions that we use for the addictive behaviours, it's something that's already used within the database, the ATOP, the ICHOM, and so we feel that that's a real key strength of the tool. We've also got questions that reflect things that are already in place in Smart Recovery. So for example, the urge log and the 7-day plan, these tools are already in place in Smart Recovery, meaning that there's hopefully a bit of a sense of familiarity or continuity between the SmartTrack app and the groups themselves. So I thought I would spend just a little bit of time taking you through some screenshots so you can get a sense of what it's like for participants and the data that they're capturing. So I mentioned the 7-day plan. So you may or may not be familiar that Smart Recovery works on a 7-day cycle. Participants are encouraged to think about the previous 7 days and then to set plans for the next 7. And so now they can do it automatically as part of this SmartTrack app. So they'll receive a landing page where if their plan is empty, they'll have the opportunity to pop the plan in. They can add as many or as few tasks as they wish, set the time, the date, opt to set a timer. And then we've got this section here where people are encouraged to reflect upon the values that underlies the task. And so this is a data collection activity, but also we know that when people are more aware of that intrinsic value, they're more likely to take steps. So as I mentioned, you can add as many or as few as you like. Once you're happy, you can set the plan. And then there's a page that'll pop up to prompt people to think about how confident they are in achieving that plan. If the scores are 7 or below, they'll get congratulated for setting that plan, but also prompted to take a moment to reflect whether or not they'd like to edit it at all, just to make it more realistic and doable, because we really want to set people up for success. When it comes to asking the questions, we have chunked them down into sections just to make it feel a bit more manageable. And that also allowed us to give a little bit of a rationale or a kind of signpost of what questions are coming up just to help with engagement. So for example, with the Substance Use Recovery Evaluator, the UK SURE, the self-care domain, this is what it looks like. And that's an example, in case you're not familiar with the tool, that's an example of one of the items from the self-care domain. In terms of our main behaviours of concern, as I mentioned, these are from the comms. And we've got people to prompt over the last 7 days, what, if any, substances they've used. Jot down the number of days. And then this one here is for those non-substance related behaviours. So we've got screener for substance and behavioural addictions, because that was something that was definitely missing when we did the systematic review, that the focus was on alcohol in particular. So now we come to the feedback. As I mentioned, we wanted to not only capture data, but we also wanted to make sure that we fed it back to people in a meaningful way. And so in terms of the feedback, we've tried to accommodate different needs and preferences around actually receiving feedback. So when we talk to people, some people love detail, some people not so much. So we've tried to incorporate a little bit of both. So there's a landing page to begin with in our progress screen, and you'll see that all of these things, they are different domains that SmartTrack captures, and they map onto the questions that people have answered. Here at a snapshot, they can scroll up and down and see how they're tracking. So going well, going less well, or whether things have stayed the same. That's based on the scores that automatic scoring in the background of the questions that they've answered. However, for people who like a little bit more detail, they can click on any of these domains. So for example, if I clicked on the self-care, I would open this page. And again, we've tried to cater to people who like visual stuff versus words. And so we've got graphs across time, as well as hints and tips and motivational statements. We've tried not to be prescriptive at all in this. We wanted the app to support smart recovery, and so we wanted it to be in a real self-management kind of flavour, if you like. So a lot of the content from here comes from motivational interviewing type statements where people are encouraged to reflect upon their progress. So the interactive urge log, one of my favourite, and also definitely one of the things that came out strongly in our qualitative interviews that participants loved. So you hit a button in the app and say that you're experiencing an urge. You're prompted to jot down the strength, or press the strength of the urge. And then what's neat is once you've done that, you'll be directed to this screen here where there's a range of different motivations and strategies to help people manage their urge. There's ones that we've put in ourselves based on the evidence, and then people can also pop in their own ones. So you can put in video, you can put in a photo, your own written stuff that reminds you of those things, why you want to make a change, why you want to manage that urge. Once the urge has subsided, then you're encouraged automatically to be able to track it. So it looks at your triggers, and then importantly, whether or not you're happy, whether or not you manage with how you managed it rather. If you are happy, you can then add that to one of your motivations. So it comes up next time. If you're not happy, you can write down what you would have liked to have done differently and then be reminded of that one next time instead. And in terms of the feedback the participants receive for our interactive urge log, it's the number of urges, the strength, and then also some of the main triggers, and all of that's based on the preceding 1 week. So even though we're developing a routine outcome monitoring and feedback tool, what came up very strongly within our qualitative interviews is that people wanted more. So they also wanted a resources section, and that's where this comes in. So in terms of resources, we've got useful readings. We've also got lived experience stories. And for those lived experience stories, I'd like to acknowledge Carla Treloar and her team. They conducted a study in collaboration with Curtin University and a range of other universities across Australia. And it's just a wealth of lived experience stories for alcohol and other substance use. And so we were able to link out to these stories as part of SmartTrack. And then we've also got a section with potentially helpful services, and where possible, the ones that we've included in the app are the ones that have 24-hour access. So that's development, that's showing you what SmartTrack looks like, just a little bit of a snapshot. And so now I'd like to spend a moment talking through our feasibility study. So for our feasibility study, we aimed to recruit 100 people, and we did a baseline assessment. People used the app for 8 weeks, and then I did a follow-up assessment with them 2 months later after that 8-week period. From this slide, I guess the main take-home point is that the people that we ended up recruiting into the study are very typical of what we would expect to see within a smart recovery group. We have the majority of people who are male, with alcohol as the primary behaviour of concern, and a lot of mental health related treatment that had been received. So that sense of comorbidity that we know is quite common. And I'm happy to report that we can say that participants did engage with SmartTrack. So of our study participants, 94% created an account, and then 88% went on to use SmartTrack at least once beyond that account setup. So we've got very few people who are just dropping off quickly. And in fact, across our study period, the majority of our samples, so 58% of our sample used SmartTrack for at least 5 or more weeks. Not necessarily consecutive, people kind of dipped in and out of using SmartTrack, but they used it for at least 5 or more weeks. And to get this data, we captured back-end data analytics using amplitude analytics. So when people clicked on different bits of the app, we were able to track how often, how long, and which bits they were using. So not only did people use the app, they also used it for entering the routine outcome data. So in our first week, we had 83% of our study participants who entered data for at least one or more of the domains that are captured, and then a little bit of a gradual decline over time to about a third of the sample by the end of that 2-month follow-up period. Really typical when it comes to use of apps, that there is a bit of a drop-off across time. You probably know it yourself when you've downloaded an app, all gangbusters in the first couple of weeks, and then there's a little bit of a drop-off across time as the novelty changes. But the thing that's really good is that our retention rate is as good, if not better, than what we can see within the published literature. Okay. In addition to that, we've got consistently positive quality assessment. So that speaks to the acceptability of our tool, that on this particular scale, which is the mobile application rating scale, 1 is inadequate, 5 is excellent. So all of our average ratings across all of these domains suggest a high quality app. And then this is also consistent with the qualitative feedback that we got. So when we did the feasibility study, in addition to that 8-week data collection activity, we also did additional qualitative interviews with a sample of participants and facilitators at the end of the feasibility study. And people found SmartTrack was user-friendly, engaging, useful. Even people, and these are pseudonyms and these are direct quotes from some people just to sort of highlight this point, even people who would describe themselves as maybe not technologically apt were surprised as to how well they were able to use it. And same thing goes for our Smart Recovery facilitators. The facilitators that we talk to seem to appreciate the added value that SmartTrack brought to the groups. It was something that participants could use outside of the group, something that could potentially stimulate discussion in the group. And then we also found that some of the facilitators were using that themselves and finding it to be of use. So although we've got this data for feasibility and acceptability, that we've really been able to develop this tool that people engaged with, and one that fit well with the Smart Recovery model. Also really importantly, as part of this process, we got some really good feedback on how we could improve the tool. How we could improve the integration to increase the uptake, things that we could do to make it easier to understand, to access, to orient people to the app. Basically things that we could do to enhance the engagement beyond what we're currently seeing and to really improve the user experience. And so one thing that's incredibly exciting is that not only have we been able to receive this feedback, we've been able to highlight some of those key opportunities. And then thanks to an incredibly generous donation from someone who's really passionate about Smart Recovery, we've actually been able to action all of these. So they're in the process. I think they're all done and ready to go, just waiting on us. We needed to update our privacy policy. So that's with ethics. We're waiting on ethics feedback, and then we're really excited to say that we'll be able to launch the new improved version of SmartTrack. So my email's at the end of the presentation. If you're interested in being kept in the loop about when that's going to be available, feel free to flick me an email. So in summary, we've been able to develop something that's been informed by end user expertise, by best practice recommendations, by evidence. We've got evidence that it's something that's feasible, it's acceptable. It allows us to be able to have that holistic, multi-dimensional, person-centered progress monitoring and tailored feedback. And to the best of our knowledge, it's a world first, especially within the mutual support community, to be able to have this kind of tool for progress monitoring and feedback. Thank you very much, and appreciate your patience with my technical difficulties at the beginning. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alison. That was a really engaging presentation, and what an amazing translation of that connection feedback. I particularly like the description of the urge log and that idea that you can really personalize it. And I think that that really is very engaging for people. I'd like to also acknowledge Ryan McLaughlin is now joining us as well for the Q&A. We've got a couple of minutes, and also Associate Professor Peter Kelly. So I do have, we've got a couple of minutes for questions. People can enter those questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You may need to move your cursor over your screen to be able to enter a question, but please do send us through a question. The first one is from Joanne Ross, who is involved in the support for the ministry end of these projects. She really commends you for your work, and she wanted to know whether you looked at the differences in the client characteristics of those who went on to use the app in relation or to the others that perhaps didn't continue. Was there anything there that gave you some hints about why people continue to use the app?
That is an amazing question, and one that is yet to be determined. We've got the data sat there. It's just a matter of being able to go through and analyse that. We weren't sure originally whether or not we were able to capture that, because the way that the back end data works, it's like an aggregate. All of these people use it in this particular time frame. But since then, we've been able to play around and be able to extract out individual usage stuff so we can ultimately match it. But at the moment, to be determined.
Thanks, Alison. I've got a couple of questions. I'm wondering about, do people in accessing the app, are they able to do that only via the group involvement, or can it be separate, or what does that look like?
Yep, it maybe can Ryan? Be. Oh, sorry, Ryan, did you want to?
No, you're fine, Ali. So.
Okay. Yeah, it can be either or. So we designed the app with the goal, I guess, of being able to integrate it into smart recovery groups, suspecting that it would be something that would support and enhance what people are already doing. But people can access it independently. It's free to access within the app stores. We just recommend that it's used in conjunction with Smart Recovery Group, or I guess that's what it was kind of developed for.
Or not just Smart Recovery groups, but also Smart Recovery printed materials, so long as there's some sort of complement going on.
Yeah, that makes sense, Ryan. And the other thing I wanted to ask you before we move on to the next presentation is, one of the really other fascinating parts of this process, as you were describing, Alison, is the time it takes to really ensure that it's got feedback from users, it's gone through lots of testing phases. And I ask you this because I think sometimes people feel like they can do an app. They maybe have got a 12-month period to do it in. They've got X amount of budget. And I just wanted to ask perhaps yourself, Alison, also Ryan, is there something else that could be learned about this project for other members, for example, who might be wanting to go down this path around the actual time it might take, the things to keep in mind?
It's definitely a longer process than what we anticipated. We're incredibly grateful for the patience and the expertise of GHO. And I think just one thing to keep in mind, it's going to take longer than you expected, and it's also likely to cost more than expected. And I think that that's another shout out that I have yet to do, is that the actual man hours that GHO ended up putting into this progress was almost double what we budgeted. So we've been able to create this high quality tool, but had we not had such a fabulous partner, I think it would have been a bit more challenging. That's something that with the app that we've been able to develop, hopefully it goes beyond what's currently available, because as you said, many people can kind of just flick together an app, but it's not necessarily grounded in the evidence or user informed or high quality. Sorry, Ryan.
No, I was just going to add, I totally concur with what Alison said there, because I mean, to do with the feedback, had it not been the association that we had with GHO and their creative minds, I think Alison and Peter would agree, we went beyond our own expectations regarding the feedback. And we've now got GHO as engaged, continual, because this is not the end product.
Yeah.
It's still got a long way to go. And I think people got to bear that in mind.
Yeah.
I think that's really helpful advice, Ryan, because I do know that there's an appetite for these types of support tools. And you're quite right, it's really clear to me, particularly when you articulated, Alison, all those different stages and steps and keeping the evidence close by, having those outcomes included. I think it really makes a big difference if you're able to appreciate the time and the effort that might be going through. I'm aware there's a couple of more questions, but I'm just also aware of time. So what I might do is, those who put questions to Alison and the team, we can pass those on so that you do get a response. But I'm going to now turn, if that's okay with everyone, to our second presentation. So thank you so much, Alison and Ryan and Pete.
Thank you, everyone.
And the whole team. Really fantastic project, very exciting. And obviously, there's a real opportunity to contact them for more information to find out how you might consider this or access the app indeed itself. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Ellie Marceau. She will be presenting to us a specific project that was done as part of a project with a Triple Care Farm. And she is going to be presenting on an evaluation of dialectical behavioural therapy for young people in residential substance use disorder treatment. So, Dr. Ellie, I will hand over to you. Once again, everyone, don't forget that you can keep sending those questions through in the question and answer box. Over to you, Ellie.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Susie, and thank you very much to NADA for hosting this wonderful webinar series. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to Alison and the team for presenting on such a fantastic and interesting and innovative project that was really comprehensively designed and evaluated, and is really at an interesting intersection of, I think, kind of what we can do with technology now to improve our clinical practice. So yes, like Susie said, I'm presenting on behalf of the team for our project, which was evaluating a dialectical behaviour therapy group for young people in residential substance use disorder treatment. And I'd also like to start by acknowledging the Dharawal people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I'm standing today for this webinar. I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and those that are emerging. And I'd also like to really extend that respect to any of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that we may have in the audience today. So I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm also only one member of a wonderful team that's worked together on this collaborative project with colleagues both from the University of Wollongong, Macquarie University, and of course, Triple Care Farm. I'd like to also acknowledge the funding support that we've received to conduct this evaluation. And finally, but very importantly, I'd like to acknowledge Triple Care Farm, which of course we've received a lot of support and engagement from both the staff and the residents in terms of completing this evaluation. So for any of you that aren't aware, Triple Care Farm is a residential treatment setting for young people aged 16 to 24 that tend to present with substance use disorder problems that are particularly at the more moderate to severe end of the severity spectrum. You can see an aerial picture here of the farm, which is an absolutely beautiful setting located about an hour south of Wollongong on the south coast. I won't say too much about the overall service model at Triple Care Farm, but we are very lucky to have Gabriella Holmes here with us today, who is the area manager, who I'm sure will be very happy to ask any questions that arise about the wider service model. For the purposes of our project, we were focused on an evaluation of the residential rehab component, which is a 12-week program for young people in the service. And it really comprises a range of different components of treatment, which all work in harmony to support the young people who often present with those comorbid psychological disorders and other complexities in terms of their background. So there's lots of different components of the treatment at Triple Care Farm, but we were particularly interested in the dialectical behaviour therapy group program, which you can see some residents at the farm taking part in that intervention. So if you would like to know more about this particular intervention, we do have available freely online the therapist manual for this intervention, as well as a participant workbook. And there's also a supporting website resource which tries to integrate some of that technology and support some of the work being done in the intervention. So you can access these manual and workbook at the Project Air Strategy website, and I've got the link here to the DBT regulator website if you're interested in having a look. And to let you know that these resources were originally developed as part of a collaboration between Mission Australia and the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education. And really what it was seeking to do, I guess, was formalising some of the DBT group practice that had been occurring at Triple Care Farm for some time, and essentially creating a formalised manual which is all about, I guess, catering this particular treatment to young people in a substance use disorder setting. To say a little bit more about the research context, so we do know that there are a large proportion of young people who are seeking treatment for problematic drug and alcohol use. So approximately 40% are aged under 30. And from the literature, there is a real lack of research that's investigated, particularly the effectiveness of residential rehabilitation treatment settings for young people with substance use disorder. But despite this, we know that it is really a crucial opportunity and area for further work, and particularly in terms of providing early intervention to those young people who are most at risk in terms of going on to develop more serious problems with substance use in the future. So like we've been speaking about quite a lot already today, psychiatric disorders do frequently co-occur with substance use disorders and complicate treatment, as I'm sure you are all aware. And in terms of factors that are related to early dropout from treatment, which is often associated with poorer outcomes, there have been a range of studies that have looked at these, and 4 of the most commonly identified risk factors for early dropout are personality disorder, younger age, low treatment alliance, and cognitive deficits. So to tell you a little bit more about dialectical behaviour therapy for those of you who might not be so familiar with this particular psychological intervention. So it was originally created by Marsha Linehan in the early 90s. And essentially she developed it as a treatment for her clients who were showing chronic forms of self-harm and suicidality and really weren't responding well to existing treatments. And to do this, she blended principles from both behaviour therapy and Zen Buddhism. So it's traditionally delivered using different components of both a group component, individual therapy, as well as telephone coaching in the most comprehensive delivery of DBT. But there are a lot of other studies now that are looking at either group or individual only deliveries. So the 4 modules that comprise, I guess, the core content of this intervention are mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. And there is some research that supports its use, which is a lot more widely in terms of the original group that it's often associated with, which is borderline personality disorder. But there is some evidence to support that it is an effective treatment for other problems such as substance use disorder. And at Triple Care Farm, the way that this particular intervention has been adapted is that upon entering treatment, at Triple Care Farm, young people will be invited to a pre-treatment session, which is essentially a way to orient them to this group intervention. And following that, they will join one of 2 groups which have a rolling intake and hold sessions for 2 hours twice a week, which are facilitated by a psychologist and a co-facilitator, and will occur for the duration of the 12 weeks that the young person stays in the setting. So in terms of our research questions that we were interested in answering, we wanted to know what is the clinical effectiveness of DBT for young people in residential treatment. And a more exploratory question was whether there are any factors who predict who is likely to benefit from DBT. So what did we do? In terms of our methods, we had a research assistant who recruited participants upon their entry at Triple Care Farm, and we achieved a recruitment rate of 71%. We had a total of 5 assessment time points. So participants were assessed at baseline and then within the course of treatment at 6 weeks and 12 weeks while they were in rehab. And then we also had a telephone follow-up at 6 months and 12 months. So we did really work hard to increase treatment retention, and as this is commonly a problem that's encountered, and I think it's also why we need these really innovative approaches to outcome monitoring that can use technology and really assist the process. We tried to use quite a lot of contact attempts as well as reimbursement with gift cards to increase our retention rates, but we did have some trouble, particularly with the 6-month and the 12-month follow-up with lower numbers. So data collection started in January 2018 and occurred right up until March of this year. And in terms of a comparison condition, we essentially made use with what we had. So we did not necessarily have the gold standard active control condition to compare the DBT group with, but we did have some historical data that were available from 2008 to 2009 from Triple Care Farm residents. And these were residents who had received DBT. However, this was DBT delivered as a standard treatment before it was formalised in terms of the delivery of this intervention manual that's catered towards young people in the residential substance use disorder setting. So to give you a sense of some of the measures that we collected over the course of the 5 time points in this study, we did have access to some routine data, which was wonderful. Our primary outcome was the brief symptom inventory. So this is a well-known measure of psychiatric symptoms across a range of different domains. And we also had the BSI available for our control group, which was available for the first 3 time points. In terms of the secondary outcomes, we had the well-known severity of dependence scale and also the World Health Organization quality of life scale, along with the brief situational confidence questionnaire, which is a self-report measure of a person's capacity to resist the urge to relapse to drug or alcohol use. And we had the brief situational confidence questionnaire available for the control group as well. We did have a range of some other assessment measures that we included or had access to. I won't go into detail here, but the other area that we were particularly interested in was the client and therapist satisfaction with the DBT treatment, as well as creating a measure of treatment integrity, which used a checklist to look at the fidelity to the treatment manual. And here you can see a chart of our flow through in terms of participant recruitment. And you'll notice that we did have some smaller numbers at the 6-month and 12-month follow-up. So of course, I think our results, particularly for these longitudinal time points, do need to be interpreted with caution. I won't go into detail in terms of the statistical methods here for the sake of time, but I will jump right through into our results now. So initially, just having a look at the characteristics of the groups, you can see here the DBT group and the control group. So the DBT group were slightly older and also more educated than controls. And we understood this as being related to changes in school leaving age that had occurred over this 10-year period. The DBT group were also primarily unemployed, residing in rental accommodation, as you might expect, and single. And in terms of primary problematic substance, we found that nearly 40% of the sample listed cannabis as their primary substance, followed by a third listing amphetamine type stimulants. And we also had access to the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which is a screening measure for cognitive impairment that I'm sure a number of you are familiar with. And we found of note that approximately a third of the DBT group did meet criteria for cognitive impairment. We included a screening measure for borderline personality disorder. And surprisingly, we found that the majority of the sample, so 56% of the sample, screened as meeting criteria for BPD. So to move into the having a look at our outcomes over time and how people fared over the course of the intervention, in terms of psychiatric symptoms, the primary outcome. So what you can see here is changes over time for the DBT group in yellow and the control group in grey. So we saw that both groups showed reductions in psychiatric symptoms over the course of the first 12 weeks of treatment. However, these reductions were larger for the control group. And this was partly driven by the observation that we made that the DBT group overall showed higher levels of psychiatric symptoms than the control group. In terms of our secondary outcomes, so confidence to resist substance use, we again saw favourable changes for both groups over the first 12 weeks of treatment. And we did see for the DBT group that confidence to resist substance use levelled off and reduced by the 6-month follow-up as participants had transitioned back into the community. So looking at our other secondary outcomes, severity of dependence for the DBT group, we saw a range of reductions over time right up until the 6-month and the 12-month follow-up, which was promising. And looking at quality of life, similarly favourable outcomes here. We saw improvements in quality of life by 6 weeks and 12 weeks in treatment. So moving through to some of the exploratory analyses that we conducted to answer the second question, so factors related to response to DBT treatment, we were interested in the role of treatment retention because we know from the past literature that completion of treatment is often associated with better outcomes. And in order to investigate this a little bit more, we created a short stay group who had stayed in treatment for 8 weeks or less. So in other words, left treatment early, and a longer stay group who had remained in treatment for more than 8 weeks. When we had a look at the differences in the baseline characteristics of these groups, we found only minimal differences. And when we looked at outcomes over time and how they tracked for both of these groups, we found that both of them showed similar favourable changes. So the second exploratory analysis was looking more at the role of BPD symptoms. And this was partly driven by, I guess, previous findings in terms of the empirical literature relating personality disorder to dropout, and also the fact that we saw a huge 56% of the DBT group meeting screening criteria for BPD. So when we included BPD symptom severity in the models that we used to look at outcomes over time, we saw that higher BPD symptoms were associated with greater psychological symptoms and lower quality of life. And also that in terms of severity of dependence, there was some evidence to suggest that people with the most symptoms of BPD would benefit least from treatment over time. So you can see here the McLean screening instrument, which is the 10-item screener that we used, and the individual items, as well as how frequently they were endorsed in the entire sample. So we saw quite a lot of BPD symptoms within this group. And moving on to satisfaction with treatment, so how satisfied were the residents with the DBT group? We collected the group session rating scale, had quite a few responses there that we were able to analyse, as well as a brief quantitative evaluation of client satisfaction across some different time points. And overall, we saw quite high levels of satisfaction with the treatment, at least from a quantitative perspective. How satisfied were therapists with the delivery of the DBT? We only had one item that was assessing this. Again, we found moderate to high levels of satisfaction. And was treatment delivered with fidelity to the manual? So in terms of the checklist that we developed, you can see those domains here, both for the introductory sessions and the group sessions. We had co-facilitator rate treatment fidelity for 51% of introductory sessions and 40% of group sessions. And overall, we found that most of the domains were in place completely, if not partially. So there seemed to be an acceptable level of fidelity to the manual. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind presentation of some of these findings, and we do have a report which provides a lot more detail and will be made available on the UOW website, hopefully at some point in the near future. But to summarise, I guess, in terms of our key findings and answering our research questions, so what is the clinical effectiveness of DBT for young people in residential treatment? Well, we saw that both groups showed reductions in psychiatric symptoms and improved confidence to resist alcohol and other drugs, that the DBT group showed reduced severity of dependence and increased quality of life. And interestingly, that the DBT group showed overall greater levels of psychiatric symptoms than their counterparts from 10 years ago, while also showing high rates of comorbidities like cognitive impairment and personality disorder symptoms. So client and therapist satisfaction with DBT was rated as moderate to high, and we saw that fidelity to the treatment manual was acceptable. So in terms of the second question, whether there are any factors that predict who is most likely to benefit from DBT, in terms of the role of treatment retention, we saw a similar pattern of improvement over time, regardless of the length of treatment, suggesting that both young people who stayed in treatment for a shorter period of time compared to a longer time showed a similar benefit. And also in terms of BPD symptoms, we noticed that higher symptoms seem to be related to greater adverse outcomes and may even impede treatment progress. So at the moment, we do have some of these findings submitted for review in the Journal of Substance Abuse Treatment. We hope that this might be available at some point in the not too distant future for further dissemination of these findings. And in terms of our recommendations and considering future research directions after this project, well, we did find some evidence to support the effectiveness of DBT at Triple Care Farm, but of course we also need more evaluation more broadly in other agencies to look at the applicability and the benefit of this kind of intervention in a diverse range of settings. And I think in particular, further research to investigate the prevalence and the effect of BPD symptoms on treatment outcomes in young people receiving drug and alcohol treatment may be an interesting area to consider further. Pending these results, from a clinical perspective, there could be a benefit of routine screening measures in clinical practice for personality disorder symptoms and possibly more tailored specific interventions that are targeted for young people with the most severe levels of BPD symptoms. And given the increase in psychiatric symptom levels that we saw over the last decade, it does also seem that ongoing support and funding for residential services like Triple Care Farm that can cater to complex young people like these is really a priority. And finally, one other option for future research could be to look in more detail at the length of stay and how this relates to treatment outcomes. This could guide service delivery and design to match length of treatment to particular client groups and be able to stage treatment to match the severity of client needs. So in other words, this would align, broadly speaking, with a stepped care approach, which is common across other areas of mental health and can really help, I guess, in terms of targeting the resources that are available. So that's all from me. I'll hand back over to Susie for our Q&A.
Thank you so much, Ellie. That was really interesting. And I'm a big fan of the regulator materials and the group sessions. I want to welcome Gabriella Holmes, who's the CEO of Triple Care Farm, and also Professor Bryn Grenier as well to the Q&A part of the conversation. And please do send through your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. Look, I really think the opportunity for Triple Care Farm to look at innovative ways and to think about the types of approaches is really helpful. And I wanted to ask a question specifically around this flexibility, because we know that most of the research to date has been very cognitive behavioural therapy oriented for drug and alcohol, and yet we're also seeing, as you described there, Ellie, you know, high rates of cognitive impairment, trauma, and obviously you talked particularly around BPD symptoms, and so you can imagine that a heavily cognitive program can be quite a challenge for people, and young people in particular. So it's really great to see some other types of approaches being looked at. Can you tell us a little bit more about, I suppose, the flexibility of DBT, so that you're trying there, and maybe you can speak to this too, Gabriella, that often we can become quite rigid in our drug and alcohol programming, and so it's really helpful. And what I could see there is that there's opportunities through a DBT approach to be a little bit flexible and to bring in obviously that clinical expertise as well to respond to the people that are in the group. Do you feel like that was coming through? And I felt like that sort of came through in some of your results. Do you feel that that's sort of what part of the findings were as well?
I'm not sure if Gabriella or Bryn would like to speak to this, but in terms of that flexibility of the intervention, I think it's a really good point, Susie, because the manual was really designed to be used quite flexibly. And I think that it probably does have a much broader applicability across both group programs, individual work, and also to be adapted to other formats too. I think that that's probably a benefit of DBT in that modularized approach. Bryn may want to say a few more words in terms of the development of that intervention.
Look, all I'll add there is just that 50% of the group is structured and 50% is personalized. So the person needs to actually engage with the material and bring their own learnings and homework, and they have opportunities to sort of apply that in the group. So although it's structured on the one hand, on the other hand, it's highly personalized, but that also brings its own challenges. Gabriella, do you want to make a comment about that?
Thanks, Bryn. Thanks, Ellie. Great question, Susie. I think the element that makes this modular approach in DBT so suitable for young people is it has the skills development. And it has really practical ways of implementing what mindfulness might look like for young people. So as we were meeting today, we have the DBT group happening this morning, and part of their mindfulness exercise today was they were out playing cricket and using mindfulness skills with cricket, which is just a really great way of being able to engage and then apply that meaningfully in life when you move forward. This project was so exciting for me to be a part of adding to the research literature about how treatment works for young people in alcohol and other drugs treatment. And I guess I've been here for 20 years, and so being able to be a part of looking at the differences in the groups and just understanding how complex the treatment needs of young people have become, how complex their psychiatric needs, the trauma, and being able to actually add that to the research literature, which is really non-existent in this area, was just a fantastic project to be a part of, because we are starting the conversation. We're starting to be able to put pen to paper and to have academic rigour around the treatment that actually works for young people. So yeah, that was really exciting. And the flexibility for young people is great. And then having them being able to access the website when they've completed the residential component is really great as well. So they're able to kind of link back in with the website, the resources. And one of the things we're moving to do in this COVID environment is we've now developed a follow-up DBT group for young people to access online back in the community. So that's something new we've been able to do in this time, and potentially a research project for the future.
I just want to commend you all, because I think, and at this point, as we wrap up, everybody can come back on screen. What comes through so clearly is how important it is to be doing research that's coming from the field. And I suppose it's research, it's grants like this around innovation and evaluation that give us the opportunity to really boost the research that's relevant to the clients in treatment and or trying to access treatment. And so at this point, I just wanted to commend you all, to thank you all. Any other questions that people have coming through, please send them through, and we'll ensure that the relevant people are responding to them. So thank you, everybody. And I'd just like to remind everyone that on the 20th of November, there'll be the webinar series number 6, and that will be specifically looking at the evaluation of the Building Trades Group Workplace AOD Harm Reduction Program, and also outcomes from the Emotion Regulation and Impulse Control, or ERIC, intervention. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you so much to our speakers, Ellie and Alison, and to all the participants in terms of the questions. We really appreciate your time. Have a fabulous day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Take care.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.